Now these fish don't like to move around a lot, some of them. They just want to stay right here. This is my house. I want to move it all. And I'm surrounded by all boys or all girls. Too bad for me. Second, it's kind of challenging. They produce huge numbers of offspring, 300,000, 500,000 babies on average. That number can be as low as maybe 12,000 or 15,000 and as high as 2 million.
Is that per mating? Per birthing?
Per birthing, every year. Every year. And females can breed with multiple males, and so genetically they'll have a lot more reproductive output that way. And the older and the larger the female, the more likely her young will survive. So one of your questions was, do they get bigger over that course of the time? There's not indefinite growth. There is kind of a max limit, but the bigger the female, the more babies that she'll have, the larger her babies will be, and the more likely that her babies will survive. A fish that's maybe, say 8 inches long, that's sexually mature, will reproduce 12,000 babies that year. The same species that's 24 inches long will produce maybe 200,000 babies. So the bigger it is, the more babies. And so here we have a picture of a monster here. Now this is another species up from Alaska again. This is the short raker. It was caught in 2007 by a commercial fishing vessel that was based out of Seattle but fishing in Alaska. And this specimen right here was 44 inches long, weighed 60 pounds, and age estimates were between 90 and 115 years old. Now this is one of 10 that this vessel accidentally took that day. They're not targeting this species, they're targeting the pollock that are up north. And if you ever had a McDonald's fish fillet sandwich, that's the pollock that you're eating. Almost 90% is caught in Alaska, and they go into those fish sandwiches. And this is their bycatch. These are the animals that they don't really want. They just get caught in the nets. And what you're looking at here is a female. You can see the large abdomen there. She's actually full of developing embryos and eggs. This is the well. This is the life source of this species. These large, long-lived females that are putting this huge amount of output out into the environment and keeping those populations going. Without these large adult females, the whole thing starts to collapse. And there's a couple different reasons for that. So these are the babies right here. Now when they're born, they don't look like a fish really at all. They look like almost like a little wiggling worm. That day one fish there is maybe about less than 1/4 inch. Okay? They don't swim very well. They're not doing very good. 500,000 babies go out there, and less than 1% will make it to adulthood to survive to breed. And those babies, when they're out there, they're new. They're like any baby. They don't really know how to eat yet. They're not sure how to put things in their mouth. Everything's a new experience for them. A lot of these animals just starve to death trying to figure out how to eat. Another thing is that most of these animals have what's called a yolk sac in their body that their mom, it's off the original egg, and that's their food source. The bigger mom is, the bigger that yolk sac's going to be, and that will help them get through that learning curve. And after about 2 to 3 months, depending on the species, they start looking like a little small minnow fish. And these are the ones that are going to start settling out in the eelgrass beds, the algae mats, kelp floating rafts, what have you. And then after about a year, they look like miniature versions of the adults. Now that planktonic phase that I was talking about, it's when you go from a planktonic fish like that day 1 and day 17 fish to, about 3 months to 9 months later, that's called recruitment. That's coming out of the plankton, and now you're going to be a different kind of lifestyle. Recruitment is not guaranteed every single year. And what they see across the board here in the Sound and throughout the West Coast is that there's good years and there's bad years. It's good years and there's bad years. So even if the parents are reproducing, that giant fish is out there putting out 500,000 babies, some years you just get nothing. And that depends on a lot of things, oceanic conditions, availability of food sources. So it's kind of hit or miss, and it makes it really challenging. We've tried to raise some of these rockfish even at my aquarium. We've worked with other agencies as well, where basically our fish breed in our aquarium exhibits. You can see them, they get nice and round and pregnant. And what we do is we take that pregnant fish and we give it out as a loaner to a research organization. They put it in a special aquarium where the babies are born, mom stays there, the babies kind of filter out of the tank and go to a special holding tank, and then they try and rear them. So again, 300,000, 500,000 babies are born at a time. At the end of the project, they were able to rear 300. They spent $30,000 on the live food required to feed these guys. So when people talk about, well, how can we help these animals? We should do a hatchery, like a salmon hatchery. It can be very, very expensive. Very expensive and challenging. And of course, the key to survival is eat or be eaten out there. As soon as these animals are born, they're faced with a constant onslaught of predators out there, like anything is in nature. It's tough to be out there in the wild. When they're in the small planktonic or larval phase, they can be picked off by sea anemones, jellyfish, a lot of different birds go in and feed on the larvae as well. As they get a little bit bigger, they're going to be preyed upon by things like lingcod, cabezon, dogfish, sharks, and then still bigger, they can be preyed upon by marine mammals, a variety of marine mammals, not so much the orcas and killer whales, but some of the dolphins, but definitely sea lions, harbor seals, you name it. So it's tough. Oh, and they also eat each other. So a bigger rockfish is going to eat a little rockfish. It's tough. Gotta survive. So, but the thing is here to keep in mind is that this is the way nature planned it, right? Nature had a plan, put hundreds of thousands, if not millions of babies out there at once. You're going to face the onslaught, and it stays in a balance. In the end, you get a nice reproducing mass, and then the cycle continues on. And that's worked out really well for obviously about 30 million years or so, until we got here. And well, you know, this is how it goes. So commercial fisheries for rockfish really wasn't a big payoff until, you know, in the 1940s. It was mostly a little bit of like hook and line stuff, and this is true of Alaska all the way through California as well. And so a little bit was trawl caught. Now, if you guys haven't seen a trawl before, this is basically how it works. You have a large vessel dragging this big monster net. It has these two doors that pull the net open, and a lot of times what they do is they have these things called roller balls. And these are these things right here, and they just drag along the bottom. And when they're dragging along the bottom, they don't care what they're catching or what they're hitting. They destroy a lot of the habitat, and when they're going down there, it's not very selective. Whatever goes in the net, yeah, that's what we're going to take, and you get these huge nets pulled up. And so it's a catch-all, if you will. It's really effective about catching fish, but it doesn't discriminate between what you're going after. And so in the 40s, these nets were introduced, but in the 60s, a lot of things started changing. The boats got bigger, the engines got bigger, they could haul a much longer net. Then you had technological increases as well as far as things like LORAN. LORAN allows you to triangulate your position and come back to the same spot. Kind of back in the day, people were like, I'm not really sure where I went fishing that one day. It was kind of out here. Now they could go back to the same spot, like a deep reef or a deep pinnacle, and they could go ahead and clear out all these places. And so not only do they clear out most of the adult breeders, they destroy the habitat as well. Makes it really, really challenging. That's the commercial side. And then there's, well, I'm just going out recreational fishing. I'm not making a big impact, right? And now I'll let you know that I'm not against fishing. I fish myself. I work for an aquarium. We go ahead and collect fish out of the wild. I eat fish, all sorts of stuff. It's just I'm trying to give you some of the history here. So please, if you fish, please don't feel that I'm trying to attack you at all. But fishing is one of those things where you say, hey, it's just me and my friends. We're just out on the boat today. We're going out there. Now those big commercial trawlers, they tend to focus in areas where you can drag a big boat and a big net through there. And so all these little preserves are being created in these little spots where those boats couldn't get. And that's where the local fishing community said, oh, well, I can get in there with my little boat. We have a good time. And the same thing, the GPS, the LORAN, we can keep coming back to these same spots. And here in Puget Sound, the commercial fishery has always been dwarfed by the recreational fishery. And in the 1970s, a couple things happened that made it a lot worse. First thing, there was a decision called the Bolt decision where First Nations people and tribal nations, it was a federal decision that said you have to split the catch out there in the ocean. And this really meant, mostly applied to salmon. But we said all these people were fishing for salmon. Now they said, nope, half of the allotted take has to go to the First Nations tribal people based on original treaties. So now if we could catch 100 salmon every year as an individual, oh, now you're down to half that. Okay. And then a couple other decisions, Canada said, we don't like it when you guys from Washington just come over on your boats and you fish our waters and then you come back without us really knowing or telling. So we're going to stop that too. And so in the late 70s and the early 80s, local fish and wildlife here in Washington had to come up with a solution. And rockfish were basically being ignored during that time. They were just kind of this junk fish that maybe you just go get one here and there. So Fish and Wildlife actually started encouraging people to go ahead and fish for rockfish. They started making some piers and some pilings, target these animals, and the limits were wide open. Unfortunately, the biology was not really understood at that time. No one knew how long they lived or any of their life history. So by the time they kind of caught up on this, it was already too late. And by the 1980s, believe it or not, the commercial fishery was taking about 300,000 tons of fish out, 300,000 pounds of fish every year. and the recreational take was 550,000. So the recreational community was killing. I mean, like, they were just going out there. And as recent as 2004 to 2007, recreational take was about 35,000 fish every year, rockfish taken. So it's quite extensive. Now, one thing, if you look at this trophy specimen here on the right-hand side, what do you notice about that fish?
It's really big.
It's really big, absolutely. What do you notice about its eye? Its eye's bulging out. Okay. Does anyone here scuba dive by chance? Any scuba divers? You guys all know about the bends, right? You come up too quickly, the nitrogen in your blood comes out of your system, and you get sick. And so scuba divers come up nice and slow. Well, this fish may be found at 1,000 feet, okay? And there you all just hauling it up. Now, the thing is, it's not just about 1,000 feet. I can tell you, as a scuba diver, I've personally collected rockfish here in the Sound and in the Straits, and I come up very slow because I don't want to have my eyes pop out of my head. So I go very slow. I have a special computer that tells me how to come up, and I'm sitting there holding my rockfish in a bag, watching this thing go. Rockfish, unfortunately, don't have the ability to quickly let that expanding gas get out of their system. It's called barotrauma. And basically, rockfish have a balloon inside their body. If this is their spine right here, this balloon or swim bladder is attached to that spine, and as we rise or bring them to the surface, that bladder keeps expanding and expanding and expanding, and the eyes and the blood, all these problems come out. So this is barotrauma. This is bad for the fish. Now, you bring this animal up to the surface, it looks like this. Well, I want to put it back. You take it off your hook, you throw it back in the ocean, it doesn't go anywhere. Just sit there and floats on the surface. It has to be recompressed to go back in there. So even if you were fishing and say, I'm a catch and release fisherman, it's not doing a lot of good. And so right now, what Fish and Wildlife has had to do is change some regulations to actually make that a little bit easier on these guys. And even the conscientious fisherman, fisher person, that's the issue. You bring these animals up, they're not going to survive that process. So that makes it even more challenging. So the credit card analogy here, everyone understands credit cards and watch the news these days, the economy, the recession. Basically, we're in debt. We've taken out all of our big adult breeders of rockfish, especially here in the Sound, and now we're fishing for these other rockfish, and we're taking out rockfish that aren't even sexually mature yet. We're not even allowing them to reproduce at all. And so we're going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into debt, and it doesn't look good for these guys unless we make some big changes. And some of those big changes have already started. But first, we have to talk about some of the bad things. So right now, 2 species in Washington State, the canary rockfish and the yellow-eyed rockfish, are now considered, they're federally listed as threatened, which is pretty serious. And a 3rd species, the bocaccio, is listed as endangered and is basically functionally extinct in here in Washington. You just don't see it anymore. So that's some pretty serious stuff to be on that list. So what are we going to do? This is a very sad picture. You guys doing all right? It's not all doom and gloom. We're going to get better here. But there's a lot of things, positive things that we're fixing right here. So first thing, state regulations have changed. A couple years ago, the state actually invited people, citizens, whether you be an environmentalist, a naturalist, a photographer, a fisher person, a commercial fisherman, they wanted people's input on how to fix this problem. And so they developed an ad hoc advisory panel. I myself was on one of those members of the panels. There's people in this room that were on that panel as well. And we all got together and kind of fought over the issues. And it was really fun because you had all sides being represented. And one of the things that came up was they actually closed fishing for rockfish in almost all areas. It includes here in the San Juans, the South Sound, and in addition, they made some changes that said you can no longer fish deeper than 120 feet in these areas as well. Now, if you like to fish for lingcod, now lingcod are doing pretty well, you go out there and you fish for lingcod, oops, I grabbed a rockfish by accident, it's no good. So by limiting the depth that you can fish at, that's one of the ways that you can still fish for the animals that you want, and you can go ahead and probably save some rockfish in the process. So those are one of the positive changes right there. Now, for those of you who don't fish and don't scuba dive, but maybe you like to eat fish, you can do things like this. Make smart choices when you eat your seafood. Monterey Bay Aquarium came up with this thing called the Seafood Watch Card, and they just break it down into 3 simple categories: animals to avoid, good alternatives, and your best choices. And if you've got a smartphone, you can download this app straight to your phone, or you can have a little card and look at it. And what they're saying is avoid a lot of these other fish